Right, welcome to the next lecture. This one is basically on the spread of the goddess throughout the Neolithic. I realise it's a bit of a divisive subject. The As we saw in the last lecture, there has been over time a kind of movement in myth, especially through the Bronze Age, where the female element had been removed from certain Indo-European myths. So we saw that the reconstructions of such figures as Bruce Lincoln seemed that drew on this androcentric worldview, seemed to present an image of the Indo-European world, especially, as one bereft of goddesses. It's not that there weren't goddesses; it's just that the primal creative deity in these, like sort of the religions of the book, was a male god. This god that Lincoln called Twin. But we've also seen that this is perhaps a skewed image, and that originally the goddess was one of those twin pairs that was responsible for the creation of the cosmos in Indo-European myth. So the goddess has a place in these creation myths. The issue, however, has been as much due to the fact that the swing against this patriarchal image, especially in the late 50s, from the 60s onwards, have tried to present the opposite pole, and in doing so has probably tipped the balance too much the wrong way, in order to emphasize the point of the importance of goddesses in the ancient world. This has come about at the same time as a reevaluation of what it is to be a woman, and also sort of the liberation of women from certain roles in society due to things like sexual liberation, the pill. All these kind of things have fed into this archaeological investigation. So it's hard to sort of prize one apart from the other. So a lot of archaeologists discussing the goddess in the 60s and 70s did so through a lens of this revolution in gender roles. And there has been a kind of kickback against this, as we will see. But the position I'm coming from is trying to reevaluate the reevaluation, as it were. So we saw in the 50s and 60s, through works like this, Robert Graves, The White Goddess, published I think 1960, where he puts forward his idea of the dominance of a goddess in Neolithic culture, and this spreading on through pagan religion. I can't remember how I started this sentence now, but people like Robert Graves have promulgated the idea of this goddess, and then there was a kickback against this in the late 80s through the 90s. It was seen as overly a sort of inaccurate interpretation of the evidence, and so there was a swing back against the view of a mother goddess in the Neolithic. What we can now do is to reevaluate that reevaluation and suggest that, as I said in the last lecture, as Bruce Lincoln argued, that there is, as Bruce Lincoln sort of didn't argue, that there is polarity, there is male and female. We're not to look for a matriarchy as such, and the existence of a goddess, a mother goddess, over a male god, potentially. But we are to see balance between the male and the female. Although, as we'll see in this lecture, there seems to be more female iconography, especially in the Neolithic, than male. Question is, what does this mean? You can interpret it different ways. Does it point to a matriarchy? Does it point to the objectification of women at this point? This is something I'll touch on, but I won't really answer in any great depth. I haven't got the breadth of knowledge to really argue whether the depiction of women is to do with the objectification of women. It's too much of a storm for me to get involved in. So I will just put forward my ideas in this lecture. So as I said, I will start by I'll talk about the history of the goddess movement in the 50s and 60s, just briefly as an introduction before really starting to look at the archaeological evidence. And so I've mentioned Robert Graves. Now, Graves was instrumental in forming the idea that it's quite common amongst sort of prehistorians in the 60s and 70s of a matriarchal cult in the Neolithic and beyond. And he also put forward the idea of a triple goddess, sort of maiden, mother, and crone. Now, he did derive this from triple goddesses that existed in Celtic iconography, for instance, and different aspects of Greek goddesses. But for the most part, we have to remember that Graves was a poet. He started off as a war poet, and his myth of the goddess, his poetic myth, is really a set of personal beliefs where he has cherry-picked ideas from mainly Celtic and Greek mythologies in order to supply evidence for his own personal sense of female divinity. He had a number of muses to whom he would write his love poetry. This picture here shows one of his muses, Callus. I can't remember her first name. Not Maria. But there's a great book written by Robert Graves' nephew, called The White Goddess: An Encounter, which talks about Graves and his relationship with Miss Callus here. But there were a number of muses in Graves' life who he almost deified. The first of which really was Laura Riding. He famously jumped out of a window to save her once. He was very full of grand gestures, but Laura Riding had a hook nose and long curly hair, honey-coloured hair, and when you read The White Goddess, he describes the White Goddess, and he's describing Laura Riding. So it's a poetic myth, I suppose. It doesn't necessarily invalidate what Graves was writing and his interpretation of myth. He perhaps over eggs the pudding, we should say, and there's a lot of places where his interpretation of certain Celtic and Greek myths are seen through a slightly distorted lens. And his translations also of ancient Welsh poetry leave a lot to be desired. And again, are filtered through his ideas. So the book has a lot of things in it that scholars tend to shake their heads at, but as a book of evocative, poetic license, it has been instrumental in giving birth to a lot of modern thought and ideas in neo-paganism, modern witchcraft. A lot of these are based on the ideas that Graves puts forward. And I'm not going to dismiss all of his ideas just because some of them have creaky foundations. I think that his concentration on the divine feminine was very timely, and it needs to be evaluated again, I suppose. So the other main player in the revitalization of this idea of the matriarchy and the mother goddess of the Neolithic and the ancient world is Maria Gimbutas, who was Lithuanian, later went and worked as a scholar in America. She was pretty much instrumental single-handedly in creating this scholarly idea of the mother goddess, and her books, just a few of them here, were massively influential in the fields of archaeology, but more sort of in the fields of women's studies, feminism, and anthropology. To show how this kind of change affected over the years, how things developed, this book on the left, the first one, Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe, it's a brilliant book. It's dealing with what old Europe is the farming civilizations from about 7,000 BC in the area around the Balkans to the Black Sea, to about 4,000 BC before they spread into Europe. So this is old Europe. It's sort of north of Greece. But it's a time period that a lot of scholars had not looked at, this early Neolithic period. And Gimbutas wrote a book originally titled The Gods and Goddesses of Old Europe. And she soon changed the title to The Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe, because her interpretation is that she was basing her ideas on a number of depictions of human images found in old Europe, the bulk of which she said were female. There were male images, as we will see, but she is more or less correct in saying that they do tend to be more female images than male, and to suggest that this was because such imagery was of a female divine nature, as in these are images of goddesses, rather than, say, playthings, dolls, or depictions of humans, or they could have been depictions of priestesses. So she put forward this idea of this matriarchal society. Now, this is where a lot of scholars tend to argue with her, in that the conclusions, although her works were extremely well put together, very scholarly, the interpretation of her evidence has caused some complaint amongst scholars, as in they saw her as having female bias, in that she drew conclusions from her studies, as you obviously would, and seeing the large number of female depictions in old Europe, in Neolithic Europe, suggested that this said something about the culture. Obviously, it does say something about the culture. The question is what? If there are a large number of depictions of females, does it say that females were perhaps dominant in society? This is what she said. And she put forward the idea, which was an idea bolstered by ideas of prevalent in feminism at the time, that women were perhaps more peaceable than men, and so this matriarchy was a peaceful society, peaceful farming society that had been brought to an end by the invasion of male-dominated tribes from north of the Black Sea, the Kurgan culture that I've mentioned before in these lectures. So there was a kind of political slant that this almost paradisal, matriarchal culture had been brought to its knees by the warlike patriarchy. So you could see how this fed in to women's studies at the time in the 60s. But also you could see why certain scholars would argue against it, because there's no way of knowing. We don't know what language was spoken in Old Europe, for instance, even though I would suggest that it may have been a form of Proto-Indo-European, possibly. There is a possible alphabet that exists. In her book, The Language of the Goddess, she talks about deciphering these symbols. So it is possible that one day we will be able to read this script, these inscriptions, these images that appear, especially on pottery, and find out more about the culture. But until then, we're just left with the images, and it's almost impossible to tell whether an image of a woman represents a goddess, or represents a priestess, or could even represent a slave or an object of ownership. So it's without the background cultural knowledge, it's very easy to explain these figures in whatever way you like. And so this is why people have been dismissive of matriarchal society. They say there has never been a single culture that has a mother goddess found in sort of world anthropology. The idea of this magnanimous, powerful female divinity is kind of a fairyland image. It's not based on reality. It's based on feminist wishful thinking. But just because we have no evidence of this in current world cultures, or those which have written material down that we can investigate from the past, doesn't mean that these matriarchal civilizations didn't exist in old Europe. It just means that it's open for discussion. So what we saw is that after the 60s, there was a backlash against Maria Gimbutas, especially in anthropology and archaeology. Now, one example of this is Colin Renfrew, who I've mentioned a lot in these talks. And when I was doing my PhD, I met Sir Colin. I was introduced to him by Tim Darville at a conference. And when Tim explained to him what I was doing for my PhD, saying that I was looking at these possibly Neolithic myths, trying to trace them back to Indo-European times, the first thing he said to me, he looked at me and he said, "Well, as long as you don't go down the Maria Gimbutas route." So the very first thing that is it Lord Renfrew said to me was a warning: don't go down that goddess route. And what he didn't know was, at the time, in my rucksack, which I had on my back as we were speaking, I had, I think, 2 of her books. Obviously, I didn't say this. I don't know why. But apparently they had worked together when sort of in the 60s or something. But they had then fallen out. So I don't know what the falling out was about, whether it was just an ideological falling out. But it seems to me that this warning may have been kind of don't go down the slippery slope of the matriarchy and into those 1960s interpretations which have been dismissed. But they've been challenged, but it doesn't necessarily mean they've been dismissed. So we see a number of papers have been written on the female imagery and reinterpreting the feminist idea, especially Peter Ucko. He's written a number of papers on the decline of the matriarchal idea, the decline of the goddess. Also, if you read Ronald Hutton, his book Pagan Religions of the Ancient British Isles, he talks about the decline of, or at least the argument against the mother goddess. And he's fair in his assessment. There is an argument to be made against these ideas. But equally, having risen in public consciousness in the 60s and 70s, and then being dismissed in academia, you find in academia in these days that it's a bit of a taboo subject. And so having been brought to public attention so recently, it's sad to see that it's almost become anathema to talk about it, which is really part of the reason why I'm interested in talking about it, because what I'm interested in isn't some political agenda. I'm interested in what I want to know what people believed in the Neolithic, and if it's a goddess rather than a god, or a pair of gods and goddesses, then all I'm interested in is what the evidence says. Here's another paper, A Myth of the Mother Goddess. So even by the end of the 60s, the idea of the all-encompassing mother goddess was being dealt a kind of a serious blow. But the evidence. What does the evidence say? Unfortunately, we don't have as many written sources as we'd like, so we have to rely on imagery. But how do you categorize the imagery? So, for instance, we have, and this was a mainstay of Gimbutas's arguments, we have female figures from Neolithic Malta. This is one from Tarxia. But these are found mainly associated with tombs, and they are definitely female images of large women, possibly pregnant. So the idea is of a mother, of a fertile mother. Now, there's no doubting this. There's no, is this early pornography, for instance? This is what some people would argue as a counter argument. That sort of argument doesn't seem to hold water for me. But what people have also said is that other ideas put forward in the 60s, such as that the shape of the temples also represent a mother figure. As you can see, this one of the temples on the right here in Malta. Such an argument has actually been challenged, and probably rightly so, because when we look at the development of these tombs, we find they're not built like this. This is a two-stage tomb. So you originally find oval-shaped structures, and then other structures built later on as sort of antechambers. So we're not looking at it. Someone has not decided to lay this temple in the shape of a mother, so that the dead will be placed in Mother Earth for rebirth. And because we now know this, because it seems unlikely to have been the case, it's just a kind of coincidence that the shape of the tombs, when you have tomb and antechamber, over time develop into the shape of a goddess. Doesn't mean we can then say that the whole culture must be dismissed as a mother goddess culture. And who's to know whether the people who put the tombs together then realised that they had sort of coincidentally created this shape. We don't know their thought patterns. Just because we don't see the development like this initially doesn't mean that it didn't later have that kind of symbolism for the people who built it. So we're going to start way back, actually, before the Neolithic, when we're tracing the origins of female representation, because that's basically what this lecture is. It's a history of female representation. And, you know, some of the earliest figures found in prehistoric art, especially sort of mobile figures that you can carry with you, rather than figures painted on walls, which sort of the early cave paintings tend to be of animals and to be involved perhaps in hunting magic. The earliest carved portable figures do seem to be mainly female. There are exceptions. There is, for instance, a figure of a lion man, who's very early. I think that's about 40,000 BC. I may be wrong, but the female figurines, and these are the famous Venus figurines, start to appear about the same time, 40,000 BC. So here's one of the first ones, Venus of Hohlefels, or of Schelklingen, and she's quite small, actually. I'll show you a picture next, that she would fit in the palm of the hand. Now, we don't know whether she has a head. It looks like she has a small head to one side, which looks a bit odd, but there seems to be a loop through it. So this may actually be for a pendant. So it may be where the figure hung. So we have a torso rather than a whole figure. And as you can see, it's very much distorted, or certain features are highlighted. So you can see obviously large breasts and large hips with the hands on the stomach, on the large stomach, which are inscribed with lines suggestive of some kind of either tattooing or clothing. So here we can see the size of it is tiny. So it could have been worn as an amulet. So possibly by a priestess, if we have figures that acted as priestesses back then, or perhaps it's a charm for pregnancy, for health during pregnancy, a sort of life-giving mother. Obviously, what are being stressed are the breasts, which suggest the feeding of a child, and also the hips, the childbearing hips, and also the laying on of weight, which would obviously be important during pregnancy. So we would say that it was a pregnant figure. Other figures aren't perhaps as representative of this female pregnant Venus figure that we're more common with. This Venus of Galgenberg, Austrian, she seems to be doing, well, she's kind of, looks like she's doing a John Travolta kind of Saturday Night Fever dance. But the majority do tend to be these distorted and regular symmetrical figures. So this figure, which is slightly later, 29,000 BC, she's from the Balkans, Venus of Dolny Vestanicha, and she's actually made of ceramics. So this is the earliest discovered use of ceramics, and it's as a female figurine. And as you can see, pendulous breasts, large hips and stomach. It's not the face, although the eyes are shown, the face isn't emphasized. It's not a portrait of an individual. You would say it was more symbolic of a female icon of all women, perhaps a goddess, symbolic of motherhood. Now, some of these figures look strangely distorted to our modern sensibilities. They almost look like abstract modern art. Here we can see the French Venus of Lespugue. The French is atrocious. She's later an ivory carving, and again you can see the hands over the breasts, and the breasts are really hanging low. Here's a Venus of Willendorf. I'll just flick through these, won't take too long. But you do also find more abstract figures, and these tend to be in ivory or bone, and may have been kind of talismanic. So they're very portable. You could take them with you, perhaps as kind of charms. Now it's easier to make one of these shapes out of a piece of antler, so maybe the form of the material is limiting the shape that it's produced, and eventually they become almost totally abstract. Here's the Venus of Monrose. We'd perhaps not know that was a female figurine if it wasn't for other examples which are more anthropomorphic. Now, one of the questions is, what do they represent? So if they are birthing charms, for instance, or whether they represent, as I said earlier, a kind of objectification of women. Are they kind of early pornographic images? One argument against this was Leroy McDermott's paper, Self-Representation in Upper Paleolithic Female Figurines. The argument here was that the distortion in the shape of a lot of these figurines was actually due to perspective, and it was because they were, in a way, portraits of a female form by a female. So it's what you would see if a female was looking down at her own body, which also would explain why the head is not important, because you can't see your own head, you're just seeing your body. So maybe these are almost self-portraits of female experience. And you can see here there's a suggestion that you're looking down. You're not looking forward at very obese figures. You're looking down on a normal physique, I would say. So let's hope YouTube doesn't ban this for bodily imagery, but you can see where the idea comes from. So that's representations of females in the Paleolithic period. There's not much from the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age. Aside from some of those late antler images, but when we enter the Neolithic, the period of farming, which starts normally around, we're sort of on the cusp of it, about 10,000 BC in certain parts of the Near East. When we enter the Neolithic, we start to get a lot more representations, possibly because people are more settled. They're also working in ceramics, so we have a lot more material that can survive, and they're staying in one place. So we do have accumulations of evidence. We have the first real settlements. So of course the evidence is just easier to come by and more abundant. So I'll start off by looking at the site of Göbekli Tepe, which is 10,500, somewhere around there, BC, and that's in southern Anatolia. That's the first evidence we have. It's on the cusp of the Mesolithic and the Neolithic. It's the first evidence we have of monumental building in the Old World. I will then look at Çatalhöyük, which is a site in Turkey, further west than Göbekli Tepe, and about 3,000 years later. And there we have imagery and also paintings in the form of paintings and some figurines. And then we will have a quick look, before I look at the proper Neolithic European material, Gimbutas's Old Europe. I will have a quick look at material from Egypt and the Near East to see what their depictions of the female form were like, and whether these bear any relation to those found in the Neolithic in Europe. So we're trying to see whether there is any form of transmission of this female imagery and what it might mean with the spread of farming from Anatolia at the start, 10,500, all the way through to the time of Stonehenge. So Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe has been excavated over the last 20 years. And when I was at university in the late 80s, early 90s, there was no evidence of there being any kind of monumental building in the ancient world this early. So this came as a kind of shock to most people when the site was discovered to be so early, as I said, before 10,000 BC. And this is what the site looks like. It's basically a set of temples. I mean, there's masses of them. I think about 20% of the area of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated, and there's dozens of circular temples like this. And we just didn't think that people were building structures like this in the Mesolithic. This is sort of hunter-gatherer times. But as I said before, this is on the cusp of farming in areas where farming is about to start happening. So perhaps we're seeing people drawing together, becoming more settled, acting in larger groups. It's all stuff that is helpful if you're living in a farming culture. So this is way, but not necessarily if you're hunter-gatherers. If you're hunter-gatherers and you've got hundreds of people in one place, it sort of lessens your chances of having a good hunt. And it also means there's more mouths to feed in what is a more it's a less guaranteed food source. You have to move with the food. You have to move following the herds of deer or following the salmon. You know, if you're settled, if your culture is settled, and you can grow crops, you can feed more people, and you can stay in one place. So we hadn't expected such monuments to have appeared this early, but then. As we go on, more and more early evidence is being found of farming, of any sort of cultural trait that we formerly ascribed to sort of later periods. We keep finding evidence from earlier. So, you know, who knows how far farming may turn out to have originated. There may be evidence out there of farming in 12,000 BC, for instance, but it just hasn't been found. Anyway, we're talking here about female imagery, so let's have a look at what exists at Göbekli Tepe. So here's just a number of the temples. Now the temples are circular temples, what sort of oval temples anyway, with stones set around them, and then two larger stones at the centre, with sort of T-shaped. They're amazing monuments. They're huge, and as I said, hundreds have been found, but we're not anywhere near to have completed excavations. And this gives us an idea of an artist's reconstruction of how the sites looked. Now, what's interesting is that the temples were meticulously and purposefully buried not long after being made. So we don't know whether one was made at a time and that they then covered it over, or whether they made the whole hillside and then covered them over at once. You know, the evidence is still coming in. But what is intriguing is the shape of the structures and of the upright stones, which are anthropomorphic. So we see a number of stones which are T-shaped, and they have this relief carving on them, which is a pretty difficult way to carve. So they're carving mainly animals and geometric patterns in relief. And here we can see some of the imagery. There's a scorpion there, also looks to be a vulture. There's plenty of resources on the web if you're interested in looking at the art and its interpretation. A number of people have suggested that we are looking at astronomical symbolism. So, for instance, the vulture, some have said, could be constellation of Cygnus, and there's also, the Scorpio for scorpion. Although this does beg the question of when constellations are supposed to have arisen. I would perhaps suggest that the circle that the vulture is holding is more likely to be the sun, and there's, you see in later Egyptian culture the relation between the bird and the sun, because the bird is in the sky. I've not seen enough evidence to suggest that these are anything more than kind of animals sacred to the people of the time rather than a star map. But there is a suggestion that they are that the temples are oriented facing the rising, I think it's Sirius, in this period. But again, not enough have been excavated to really work this out. So still plenty of work to be done in that regard. Here we see a lizard. It looks like some sort of lizard, and the base on which it is found is anthropomorphic. Okay, it doesn't look overly man-like, but there are other examples, especially the center stones. Here's a small carving of a figure found nearby. So it's not one of the huge statues, it's a small figure found in the same region, but it looks to have the same characteristics, the wedge-shaped head and arms, which we'll see on the other figures. Now this one seems to be holding the head of a child, and then there seems to be a hole lower down. So is this a female figure? We're not sure. But here is a carving of what seems to be a female figure, or sort of ritual copulation, possibly. It's hard to say what's going on, really, but there's definitely that same kind of elongated head, which may suggest hair and breasts, and the open legs in either a image of sexual congress or giving birth. It's just too hard to say. But what it does suggest is that the female figure is important to these people, as it should be. What it says about the culture, not enough information for us to say. It's different, however, when you look at Çatalhöyük, as I say, about 3,000 years later, but because it's roughly the same part of the world as Göbekli Tepe, probably deriving ultimately from the same farming cultures. And we definitely have at Çatalhöyük, which is a large settlement rather than a ritual site. I suppose you would call it a town. It's like the pueblos of the American Southwest. It is a large mud brick city, I suppose. But we have evidence here of burials and of ritual space. In fact, there tends to be a conversion of the rooms that these people are dwelling in into shrines and burial places. They're then covered over and another room placed on top. So an old room, perhaps where someone has died, becomes a shrine, maybe to the ancestors, and then is built upon. So there's a sense of almost like a high rise going on, as we will see. So those of you who know anything about the Pueblo cultures of sort of Arizona and New Mexico will see how these are very similar structures, mud-built structures with entrances in the roof. What's important about these is the state of preservation. Also the early dates, we're talking 7,000 BC, I think. But the preservation of them was amazing, including frescoes on the wall and sort of intact burials. Here's another image of sort of a vulture's point of view, and the vulture is an important bird in their iconography, as we will see. So this gives an impression of how the life in the town may have looked. And here's the location of it in relation to the Taurus Mountains. And in one of the rooms, you had this image, this mural, which you can see at the bottom, which seems to be, if not a map, then it's a depiction of the city. And in the background, what some people have described as the twin peaks of a mountain. Now, this will be important later on, especially in the next lecture, when I talk about the twin peaks and the sun rising from out of these as an image that is found throughout the Neolithic world. And it may be that it starts here. Maybe that the mountains are seen as the horns of a cow, a sacred cow, or as the breasts of a sacred mother. That's one interpretation. Either way, they seem to be depicted in this mural. But aside from this sort of realistic map, what we also have depicted are images of females and vultures and horned animals. So we have these so-called shrines where we find bucrania, that's cow's heads or bull's heads, and these are associated often with animal jaws, sort of foxes or pine martens, the sort of predatory animals, and sometimes there are plaster breasts on the wall with these animals' jaws in them. So there's been a lot of argument over the interpretation of this imagery. Does it represent a matriarchy, or does it represent a kind of fear of the female? The biting breast. It's a very sort of psychoanalytic image. Again, we don't know. Is it a question of a life-giving and life-taking female goddess who gives life and destroys? You think of later Egyptian tradition, you have goddesses like Hathor, who is the cow goddess, and yet she is the other side of the goddess Sekhmet, who is a goddess of destruction and is lion-headed. So there she is both nurturing breast and also destroying carnivore. It's the same imagery that we see at Çatalhöyük. So are we looking at a continuation of tradition? In which case, you wouldn't look at Hathor and Sekhmet, who are important Egyptian goddesses, as some kind of evidence of misogyny. as people have argued for Çatalhöyük, that it's a fear of women. So, it's useful. This is why it's useful to compare these ancient cultures and not just to leap to certain conclusions. Here's another one of the shrines, and you can see a number of bucrania here, underneath a female figure with her legs open, sort of giving birth to these bulls. And this, again, is a figure that we find in mythology and iconography right through to sort of Greek myth, with Europa the bull and certain goddesses who give, the birth of the Minotaur, this kind of symbolism. So it seems that, it could be that the bull is a male image, as in the son of the goddess, or it could be that we're looking at a female cow, because cows do have horns. They just, modern domesticated cattle have had the females have had the horns bred out. But here we can see that this figure is probably a horned figure rather than those being ears. And we'll have another look at this image later, because there seems to be a circle or sphere on the belly, which is either a pregnant belly or it could be a depiction of the sun. And that makes us think of the divine cow goddesses of Egyptian religion who give birth to the sun. And here's a reconstruction of the shrine room. We also have this female figure, which reminds us of the female figures from Europe from 40,000 to 20,000 BC, sort of the Venus of Willendorf kind of images. Again, large, possibly pregnant mother, and associated in this case with two beasts either side. It's hard to see what they are. They look kind of like lambs or something, but they could be cattle with the horns missing, or they could be felines. We see imagery of female divinities flanked by lions in later Greek, Minoan iconography, for instance. So here's the image above the door, or a version of it. Again, woman with parted legs, perhaps in the act of giving birth, and here covered in kind of looks like crazy paving pattern. But the interesting patterns, as far as I'm concerned, for what we will discuss later, are the circle at the centre, the sun circle, and above this the lozenge. We can see at least two or three, actually going up to the throat, lozenges along the belly. And this is important because the lozenge and the circle are important images in later Neolithic art in Europe. And here's reconstruction of certain imagery said to have been found on the walls of Çatalhöyük. I say said, these are recorded by an archaeologist called James Mellart, and there was a lot of controversy over just how much of what he recorded was accurate and how much was actually made up. So we should be slightly cautious in using these images, but they are very much akin to the Venus of Willendorf figures and also the Maltese figure that I showed at the beginning from Tarxian. And obviously the Göbekli Tepe, we're looking at a similar iconography. If this is the case, then this iconography has already been around at least 3,000 years from the start of the Neolithic, possibly 23,000 years from the start of the production of these mobile artworks. These are a pair of animal heads, which are also the breasts of the goddess, which I mentioned earlier. And here's the excavations taking place under the American scholar Ian Hodder, and he famously doesn't like ascribing this matriarchal image to the females at Châtelheuig. He tries to sort of distance himself from those interpretations. He rightly points out that female icons, male icons, and phallus symbols were found during excavation, and he suggests that other evidence, such as burials and depictions of figures, suggest more equality, which is in line with what I was talking about in the last lecture about the male and female equivalents in Proto-Indo-European myth, that they actually are a unity, the male and the female. So there's an equality there. So what he's doing, he's not saying that there were no mother goddesses or goddesses at Châtelheuig, only that he doesn't go for the Maria Gimbutas idea that it was a matriarchy. And I can see where he's coming from in that, but it does seem that the goddess of life and death is very important in the cult, whatever the cult was, and that male images just aren't as important, or maybe they were around but were in a different form. Maybe, the male image was made of wood and hasn't survived, or maybe the bull represents the male, and so it seems to suggest there are more female humans than male, but the balance was there. So moving on to Gimbutas's Old Europe, this is more or less where these cultures arose, and we're talking from after 7,000 BC all the way up to about 4,000 BC. So we're looking at the spread of farming into the Balkans from Anatolia, and the farming cultures that developed in the Balkans at this time, which show an amazing array of female imagery. So here we see the spreading of farming via Greece, then on to Italy. Certain parts of it go along the Mediterranean round to Spain, but the majority goes up through Old Europe and then along sort of Danube and Elbe rivers into Western Europe. And this is the kind of imagery that we see. Very stylized and patterned clay figurines, usually with breasts, kind of serpentine or bird-like heads. There's a whole wealth of interpretation that Maria Gimbutas has put forward. Even if you don't believe her final theories, her work in putting these together and categorizing them and interpreting the symbols is amazing. So there's sort of serpent, egg symbolism, bird symbolism, water symbolism, and it all makes perfect sense. Whether these are goddesses or not is another matter, but they're certainly strangely symbolic anthropomorphic figures. And at the heart of these cultures are the Cucuteni Tripilia culture that I have mentioned a number of times in these lectures, which influenced the steppe cultures, the Yamnaya cultures to their east, and possibly in doing so gave birth to the Proto-Indo-European culture. So my argument is that that a lot of Proto-Indo-European myth and imagery is present in Old Europe in these figurines. So that's why my interest in exploring them. And again, the images speak for themselves. Large number of exaggerated female figurines, often found grouped together exactly like this, as if taking part in some kind of ritual or worship or dance. There are a number of dances in the Balkans and sort of Black Sea and Greek area that still continue to this day. There's a brilliant book by Wayland Barber called Dancing Goddess, which talks about this, which I would heartily recommend. Now, a lot of these figures, as I said, aside from being stylized and not portraits as such, have a number of adornments. Now, whether this is body paint, that represents body paint, it's a question of whether you believe that these are depictions of the way that females in the culture actually looked, or whether it's symbolic of some sort of energy, cosmic energy or water or wind that these beings are representing. It could be that it's a representation of body paint, tattoos, or textiles. They're all a possibility. But one symbol that we see a number of times, and especially associated with the bellies or the wombs of these figures, is the diamond or the lozenge, which will become important, as I will say in this and the next lecture. And it tends to be associated with 4 dots and with a cross. So it's like a sort of almost like a checkerboard pattern. But it's associated with that region, with the womb and between the legs. There we can see it on these figurines. And we also see sort of chevrons associated with breast. So these are cultures, settled cultures, spreading from, as I said, from Anatolia to the Danube and beyond. And we think that they were quite massive circular settlements in this old Europe, especially the Cucuteni culture. I think I've shown this before, this kind of idealized image of this culture, but I like this image. And this is kind of, you can see the script at the top as well that Gimbutas has said is the language of the goddess, but just unfortunately we haven't been able to decode it. For a start, we don't know what the base language is. If Renfrew is right, it may be some form of Indo-European. Otherwise, we don't really have a chance. And here's a representation based on the figurines of what the kind of material culture of the Cucutani and Tripilia, these old European cultures may have been wearing. But as I said, these may not be true depictions of textiles. They may represent some kind of natural force. We also have depictions of houses and shrines in these cultures, and these tend to be associated with cattle as well, with bucrania at the front of the houses. And this is something that continues through a lot of later Neolithic Europe. And here's Colin Renfrew again. Obviously, his idea was that the Indo-European languages were brought with these cultures into Europe, as opposed to Gimbutas's idea, where the language was probably Kurgan language and came and overtook this goddess culture. And in myth there is a lot of conflict between the gods, and it could be that there was a sort of repression of certain elements of the female goddess culture, and the evidence is there. When in the last lecture we looked at the Indo-Iranian forms of the cosmogony, we saw that the female figures had been taken out, and so it seems that in a way Gimbutas was right. There had been a certain androcentric twist, so that the old goddesses had been relegated to a lower position in society. Now, whether this happened that early on, whether this happened when the two cultures first met, the Yamnaya and the Cucutani, we don't know, or whether it's something that happened later in the Bronze Age when society was changing. These are questions that are still to be answered. And this is just to illustrate the point I made before about the cultures, the spread of Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European throughout Asia and Europe from this central area north of the Black Sea, from the Yamnaya cultures. So now we can go on to look at just briefly the depictions of goddesses in Near Eastern and Greek cultures, where we know that the goddess is important. So no one would argue that Egyptian culture or Greek culture was a matriarchy. And I think this is why people have a problem agreeing with Gimbutas on her interpretations of a matriarchal Old Europe or matriarchal Çatalhöyük. But there's certainly no reason to say that Çatalhöyük and Old Europe weren't as equal with a male and female divinity as the later Near Eastern Egyptian and Greek gods and goddesses. So we'll have a quick look at their depictions, because I'll be arguing that the depictions we have in Neolithic Europe are part of this same wave that brought this female imagery from Anatolia and the Balkans into Greece. Anatolia directly into Greece and then into the Balkans, and into Egypt, as the same wave that brought the same imagery with farming into Britain. So as we've seen, that the goddess at Çatalhöyük is associated with a cow, so the goddess Hathor and Nut and others beside Mehet Weret are associated in the Egyptian world with with water and with the stars, especially the Milky Way, and with the rebirth of the sun. And in some myths, the sun is the eye of the cow goddess, or the cow goddess, or the sun. The cow goddess is the eye of the sun. I'm getting confused here. The eye of Ra is depicted as a female cow in certain myths. And here is Nut swallowing the sun, and the sun journeying through her body, through the 12 regions of the Duat, of the underworld, to be reborn the next morning. And as I said in the last lecture, there is a link between female divinity Tiamat and water and the Milky Way in sort of Near Eastern Mesopotamian myth. But we'll have before we get onto the Neolithic elsewhere, we will just jump ahead in time and have a look at sort of Bronze Age depictions, late Neolithic and Bronze Age depictions of the goddess in Greece. I won't take too long on this, but there's 3 areas: the Helladic, Cycladic, and Minoan, and there are similar female depictions in each. I won't take too long on this because I've already spoken for too long, but I would just click through and show the prevalence of female figures in each of these regions. So this gives us a rough time period for the appearance of these figures. So we're looking at sort of 3000 BC up to about 1000 BC. And just as we saw on some of the earlier Venus figures, we have the hands, the protective hands over what could be a pregnant belly, although we're not sure. But these Cycladic figurines that we see are often buried with the dead, and are thought to be something to do with mourning, more than with goddess figures per se. Analysis of them has been done. It shows red marks on the cheeks. That's something that still happens in Greece and the Balkans, as a sign of mourning, that women will rake their cheeks. So there's thought to be some sort of mourning aspect in relation to death in these figurines. Is a similar one, but this is actually from the Near East, but it's showing a contemporary shaped figure to the Cycladic ones, but perhaps suggesting the origin of the Cycladic are from sort of Anatolia. There's one from Naxos. And we see that these become more and more stylized over time, becoming almost spatula-like. And there's some evidence of these from sort of further north. Britain, I think, have a few sort of spatula bone shapes. Here we are, yeah, Goat's Hole Cave in Paviland, 24,000 years ago. This could be some sort of figurine, but it's hard to say. It could be a spatula for. I was going to be facetious and saying eating ancient ice cream in the Ice Age, but we'll just dismiss that. Looking at Minoan images, there definitely is the appearance of divine, fruitful female figures in a position that suggests they're being worshipped. These are definitely either goddesses or priestesses. They tend to be bare-breasted, holding the breasts in a sort of manner to suggest fruitfulness. And you also see worshippers, sometimes male worshippers, who are depicted as smaller than the women, sort of looking up to them and putting their hands to their foreheads in what is thought to be a sort of act of supplication, or the equivalent of crossing yourself in Christianity, or it's bowing. And a lot of these are associated with the peak sanctuaries, which are mountaintop shrines in Crete. And we can see here at the entrance of the temple this double horn symbol, which could either be the twin mountain peaks, or the legs of the goddess, or the horns of the bull, or all three of them. They're known as the horns of consecration, and here you can see them on the left-hand side of this ring seal. And here we see a goddess on the mountain top, bare-breasted, flounced skirt, with a male worshipper in front of her with his hand to his forehead, and she is flanked by those two lions. So remember the image we saw from Çatalhöyük earlier, with the goddess seated with the two animals either side. This seems to be a symbol that has persevered from that point. She's on top of a mountain as well, so she's kind of mountain mother. Here are the horns of consecration. And there's a possibility that the horns of consecration are linked to the Egyptian hieroglyph Geo, which is the horizon. I think it's the mountain from which the sun rises. Again, we will be looking at this in relation to twin hillsides, especially in Britain, in the next lecture. There's the Egyptian image with the sun between the two hills. And here again, the goddess flanked by beasts. On the left, from a ring seal from, might be a gemstone from Knossos, I think, and the right from Çatalhöyük. The one on the left, you see the horns above the head, and also a double axe, the labyrinth, which is another sacred image of the Minoan female divinities. Here are more rings with seals on them showing these goddess figures. Again, the head isn't important. These heads are suggestive almost of insects, and there were priestesses in the ancient Greek world, perhaps derived from Knossos, called Melissae, that is the bees, linked to honey. And all the imagery surrounding this goddess is with plants and fertility and growth. And we can see a hyacinth there sprouting at the bottom. And here's another goddess under the tree holding poppies, which of course are narcotic. There's a double axe, the labyrinth, after which the labyrinth is named, floating between them, and then a sun and moon and possibly Milky Way in the sky. And you can see why the idea of a kind of matriarchal paradise is suggested in such images. Are we to dismiss this? I don't know. The jury is still out, but I wouldn't mind visiting this garden. It's very paradisal. It's like Eden, but without Adam. There are male figures depicted in some of these seals, but not many of them. And there we can see a better depiction of it. That's the throne room at Knossos. And next door to that was a shrine room, and we have depictions of these female figures thought to be snake goddesses, goddess holding two serpents, the other one hands are out holding serpents. They have a sort of diadem and the bare breasts and the flounce skirt. And there is references in the inscriptions from Knossos about offerings being left to the Potnia, the lady of the labyrinth. So this goddess figure is very important in those cultures. And his depictions of contemporary goddesses with the poppy on the brow and the arms in that sort of worshipping position. So it's a question of whether there is the use of taking opium in these cults, which makes them even more kind of paradisal. It is a depiction from a later Greek artwork with Persephone, goddess of the underworld, holding poppy stems and the torch of the underworld. So there's a question of whether the cults celebrated in Knossos involving the goddess and the poppy were the origin of the later mysteries of Eleusis, of Demeter and Persephone at Eleusis near Athens. We also have evidence of goddesses in the later Mycenaean world. I say later; they do sort of overlap, and the later phases at Knossos are Mycenaean in nature. The Mycenaeans were a Bronze Age culture from the mainland who did overtake Knossos in Crete. I think around sort of 1700 BC, I think was the sort of apex of that, around the time of the eruption of Santorini. Anyway, these the Mycenaean cults are very similar to the Minoan in a lot of ways, and again we see these female figures with upraised arms and associated with the snake. Not what you would call beautiful goddesses, more sort of I don't know, that they're more stern figures, priestess, hierophantic figures. And this is a group that were found at Mycenae. You can see the one on the far right there, at sort of the 3 o'clock position, is getting more stylized. And this is something that we start to see when we look at the depictions of the goddess in Neolithic Europe, that the stylized nature of them overtakes the anthropomorphic, and so they become more and more difficult to interpret as female figurines. But because we've seen the development, we'll be able to see that they are indeed that. And here's a later depiction of, which is more of a portrait, but I put that in just because it's such a nice image. And this one was supposed to go in earlier. This was a model house from the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, showing the bucrania at the front, as if the house represents the body of the goddess. This is something that we also find in the tombs of the ancient world, in sort of Neolithic Britain, for instance. There is a suggestion of tombs being the body of the earth goddess, and that to go inside the tomb is to be reborn. And that is something, again, which I've touched on and which I will mention either in this talk or the next one. So now I see why I put this in. This is the start towards a more symbolic representation of the goddess that we find spreading across Europe. So these are Cucuteni Tripilia pieces of art. Well, the one on the right is anyway. The one on the left is Teaser culture. It's the same, broadly the same area of the Balkans. But we're seeing forms associated, shapes and images associated with a female figure which will spread. And these include the bucrania, the triangle, especially sort of associated with the pubic regions, and also with the same symbolism, the lozenge. So the image on the left is actually an altar, according to Gimbutas, with a face in the womb area. And we'll also see that there starts to be this strange amalgamation of these features, physical features, with the face. So that there, in this image, we have the womb and the face kind of united. And we will start to see eyebrows and eyes amalgamated with breasts, and mouth amalgamated with sort of the womb shape. They almost become a play on each other. But it's hard to explain, but it becomes clear when we look at the actual imagery. So tracing the cow-horned goddess to Egypt is easy. We've done that. The image of Mehet Weret, the Great Flood, who is the Milky Way and also the Nile, but into whose body the dead are placed for rebirth. So there is a definite association in Egypt, as there is at Çatalhöyük, between the horns and burials, because these shrines at Çatalhöyük with the horns are often found above graves, and then where someone is buried, it then becomes a shrine. And this is also found in Neolithic European cultures. We also see the bucrania appear in certain early Greek works of art. This is a Cyclopean pottery vessel, and it looks, on one hand, think of what I said about the body and the face. If you just saw that for a split second, it would look like a laughing face with ears at the side, and then only as you look closer will you see that it's actually arms and hands and breasts, and then the belly, and the belly is in the form of the cow's head, the bucrania. So it's like a visual pun, but it's even more complicated than just face and body. It's face, body, and cow. It's got an extra level to it. On the right, we have a Neolithic image from, I think it's from the Marm region, of a what seems to be a goddess figure, and she is holding a bucrania. That's what this is. It looks like a catapult. But there's other examples where we can see it's a cow's head that she's holding sort of over the belly, and again you can see the breasts emphasized, and also the face with what could be, these are associated with tombs, could be either a tattoo or the face that's been raked by the nails in mourning. Either way, it does suggest the idea of a death goddess, and this is something borne out again and again in Neolithic structures, especially in France, and then by the time we get to Britain,